"This boat wasn't built to last," Captain Delbert Wall observed, running his hand along the bulkhead of the UNMS battering ram. "It was built to die gloriously." Major Jordan Caldwell couldn't disagree. The battering ram was one of 50 penetrator-class vessels hastily constructed for Operation Blitzkieg, ships designed with a single purpose: to pierce the outer hull of the Endurance Elect Forge and disgorge their complement of troops directly into the heart of the enemy. "That's why they gave her to us, Captain," Caldwell replied, his quantum spurs humming softly against the deck plates. "Glory's what Texas Knights do best." Hall, a career officer in the United Naval Marine Service, offered a tight smile. Though he commanded the battering ram, he had no illusions about who the brass considered the mission's true leaders. 4,000 troops, most of them standard infantry with minimal power armor. 200 melee Marines with their fancy vibroblades, and exactly 5 Texas Knights with their quantum spurs and cowboy hats. He shook his head. "Command must really believe in you folks." "Not in us specifically," Harrington corrected, looking up from his sensor readouts. "In the intelligence we gathered. Major Caldwell's team is the only unit that's actually seen the forge firsthand, which is why we're on point for the primary thrust," Powers added, checking the charge on his Thunderbird cannon for the 4th time in an hour. The massive weapon had been enhanced with components forged from the quantum reactive metals discovered on Proxima Viridian 4, its disruption field now capable of affecting targets at twice the previous range. The battering ram's bridge fell silent as they contemplated the mission ahead. Operation Blitzkrieg represented the largest coordinated military action in human history. 300 warships from a dozen different human factions, 50 specialized penetrator vessels, and over 200,000 troops, all committed to a single, audacious assault on the forge that had birthed humanity's mechanical enemies. "Final approach in 90 minutes, Wall said, breaking the silence. "You should get your team ready, Major." Caldwell nodded and gestured for his knights to follow. As they made their way through the crowded corridors of the battering ram, they passed contingents of troops from across human space. United Naval Marine Service regulars in their utilitarian armor, colonial militia, volunteers with their mismatched gear but determined expressions, professional mercenaries from the frontier companies checking their specialized weapons. Most numerous were the unarmored infantry, ordinary soldiers volunteering from a dozen worlds, equipped with standard-issue pulse rifles and basic combat suits. They represented the majority of the invasion force, not just on the battering ram but across the entire operation. "They're staring," Wilson murmured as they passed a group of colonial militia who had fallen silent at the sight of the knights. "Of course they are," Hawkins replied. "Most of them have only heard stories about Texas Knights. We're practically myths to the outer colonies." Caldwell didn't comment, but he felt the weight of those stares. The distinctive armor of the Texas Knights, with its blend of frontier aesthetics and advanced technology, stood out sharply against the utilitarian gear of the regular forces. Their quantum spurs left visible trails of blue energy with each step, marking them as something different, something special. The melee Marines they passed offered more measured acknowledgments, professional nods or slight salutes. As the main branch from which the Texas Knights had evolved, the Marines maintained a complicated relationship with their more flamboyant cousins. They respected the Knights' combat prowess, while often chafing at their tendency to overshadow the Marines' own considerable skills. "Major Caldwell," a voice called from behind them. "A moment, please." Caldwell turned to see Colonel Davidson, commander of the melee Marine contingent aboard the battering ram. The colonel's armor bore the distinctive vibroblade insignia of the Marines, along with campaign markers from a dozen conflicts. "Colonel?" Caldwell acknowledged with a respectful nod. "What can I do for you?" Davidson gestured toward a side corridor away from the flow of troops. Once they had a measure of privacy, he spoke frankly. "My Marines will be following your team once we breach. I want to be clear on the chain of command." Caldwell understood the concern. The hasty assembly of Operation Blitzkrieg had left many command structures ambiguous. "Your Marines follow your orders, Colonel. My Knights follow mine." But we're all following the operation plan. Straight to the central control node, no heroics, no heroics. Davidson studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good. Because I've heard stories about Texas Knights and their creative interpretations of battle plans. Only when the situation calls for improvisation, Caldwell assured him. We understand the stakes here. This isn't about glory or individual achievements. It's about ending the Endurance Elect threat once and for all. The colonel seemed satisfied with this answer. Very well, we'll be ready when the hull breaches. He offered a crisp salute, then rejoined his Marines farther down the corridor. He's worried we'll go off script, Powers observed once Davidson was out of earshot. With good reason, Wilson added with a slight grin. It's what we're known for. Caldwell shook his head. Not this time. Operation Blitzkieg isn't about Texas Knight showmanship. It's about overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. He checked his neural interface, noting the mission clock ticking down. Let's get to the deployment bay. I want a final equipment check before we hit the breach point. The Baton Ram's main deployment bay was a study in controlled chaos. 4,000 troops arranged in neat formations, checking equipment, securing harnesses, and offering quiet prayers or personal rituals in preparation for combat. At the very front, directly behind the massive reinforced doors that would open directly into the Endurance Elect Forge, stood Caldwell's team. The 5 Texas Knights had positioned themselves at the tip of the spear. The first humans who would set foot inside the ancient facility that had spawned countless machine enemies. Behind them waited the melee Marines, their vibroblades humming with lethal energy, ready to expand the foothold the Knights would establish. 30 minutes to breach, announced the ship's AI, its voice steady and emotionless. All personnel secure for impact maneuvers. Caldwell performed a final check of his equipment. His plasma-tipped sword hung at his hip, its quantum matrix newly enhanced with components from Proxima Viridian 4. His sidearm, a heavily modified quantum pistol, was secured in its holster. His armor gleamed with recent upgrades, neural interfaces linking directly to his quantum spurs and providing real-time tactical data through his helmet's display. Knights, he addressed his team on their private channel. Whatever happens when those doors open, remember, we're not just fighting for Texas anymore. We're fighting for everyone who's ever lost someone to the Endurance Elect, for every world they've threatened, for every future they've tried to steal. No pressure, Wilson quipped, though his voice lacked its usual light-hearted tone. We've got this, Major, Powers assured him, his massive Thunderbird cannon primed and ready. First in, strike hard, secure the breach. The rest will follow. Operation Blitzkieg commencing, the ship's AI announced. All ships, execute attack pattern Thunderbolt. Penetrator vessels, begin your approach runs. Through their neural interfaces, the Knights could access limited external feeds, allowing them to witness the awesome spectacle unfolding outside the battering ram. 300 warships of various sizes and designs converged on the massive Endurance Elect Forge, only to encounter an unexpected obstacle. A defensive fleet of machine vessels had formed a protective cordon around the ancient facility. Endurance Elect defensive fleet detected, Wall's voice came through the shipwide comm. At least 200 vessels of various classes. Command is ordering all ships to accelerate to breakthrough velocity. We need to punch through their line before they can coordinate their defense. The massive battle unfolded with staggering speed. Human warships engaged the Endurance Elect vessels in a desperate bid to create openings for the penetrator ships to slip through. Quantum torpedoes, plasma lances, and disruption beams crisscrossed the void, striking shields and hulls with devastating effect on both sides. This wasn't in the plan, Harrington noted, monitoring the tactical feed through his neural interface. The intel suggested the forge would be defended by fixed emplacements, not a mobile fleet. They know what we're planning, Caldwell replied grimly. They've committed everything to prevent us from reaching the forge. The Endurance Elect fleet moved with a perfect coordination that made machine intelligences so formidable in space combat. Their vessels adjusted positions with microsecond precision, closing gaps almost as soon as they appeared, focusing fire on any human ship that showed vulnerability. Penetrator Group Alpha is taking heavy losses, reported the ship's AI. 7 vessels destroyed, Group Beta attempting flanking maneuver. Through their tactical feeds, the Knights watched as the human fleet executed a complex series of maneuvers designed to fragment the Endurance Elect formation. Knight vessels led the charge, their unconventional tactics and unpredictable movements creating momentary confusion in the machine fleet's otherwise perfect coordination. There, Wilson pointed to a gap appearing in the defensive line as several Knight cruisers executed a particularly daring assault. They're creating an opening. All penetrator vessels, this is Operation Command, came the priority broadcast. Commit to maximum acceleration. Group Gamma, exploit breach Sector 7. This is our window. The battering ram surged forward, its engines pushing beyond safety tolerances as it aimed for the momentary gap in the Endurance Elect formation. Around them, other penetrator vessels followed similar vectors, each racing to slip through before the machines could close the breach. "Incoming fire," Wall warned. "All hands brace for impact." The ship shuddered as glancing hits struck its reinforced hull. The penetrators were designed to withstand significant damage and still complete their primary function, ramming the forge, but they weren't invulnerable. "We've lost the spearhead and trident," Wall reported, his voice tight but professional, adjusting formation to compensate. 2 penetrators gone already, Caldwell thought grimly. Each carried thousands of troops, but there was no time to mourn, not now, when every second brought them closer to their objective. "Breakthrough achieved," the AI announced. "Endurance Elect fleet attempting to pursue, human vessels moving to block intercept vectors." Through the tactical feed, Caldwell watched as the surviving human warships deliberately positioned themselves between the pursuing machine vessels and the penetrator group. It was a sacrificial move. Many of those ships would not survive the engagement, but they would buy precious time for the penetrators to reach their target. 5 minutes to forge intercept, Wall announced. "All troops, final preparations, breach teams to deployment positions." Throughout the ship, soldiers secured harnesses and checked weapons one final time. The atmosphere was tense but focused. These were professionals preparing for the mission they'd trained relentlessly for over the past 3 months. 3 minutes to intercept. Activating breach mechanism. At the front of the ship, behind massive armored doors, the specialized breaching apparatus began to power up. A combination of conventional ramming reinforcement and quantum disruption technology, it was designed to penetrate the forge's outer hull and create an opening large enough for troops to pour through. Minute to intercept. Breach teams to final positions. Caldwell and his Knights moved to the very front of the formation, directly behind the deployment doors. Their quantum spurs hummed with increasing energy, responding to the heightened tension and their own focused determination. 30 seconds to impact. The ship's engines screamed as Captain Wall pushed them beyond their designed capacity, accelerating the battering ram toward its target with reckless speed. 10 seconds. 9, 8. Caldwell drew his plasma-tipped sword, the blade igniting with a sound like distant thunder. Beside him, his Knights readied their weapons. Powers with his Thunderbird cannon, Wilson with his Lone Star launcher, Harrington with his quantum disruptors, Hawkins with his specialized infiltration gear. 3, 2, 1, impact. The collision was unlike anything Caldwell had ever experienced, despite years of combat in some of the most violent environments in human space. The entire ship shuddered as its reinforced prows struck the forge's outer hull, the specialized breaching mechanism activating at the moment of impact. Quantum disruption fields flared along the point of contact, temporarily weakening the molecular bonds of the ancient material. Reinforced penetrator spikes, driven by explosive charges, punched through the momentarily vulnerable surface. The ship's momentum carried it forward, embedding its bow deep into the forge's outer structure. But something was wrong. The resistance was greater than their simulations had predicted. The ship's forward momentum slowed too abruptly, creating catastrophic stress on the battering ram's reinforced prow. "Structural integrity failing in forward sections," Wall's voice cracked over the comm. "Breach mechanism is..." His warning was cut short by a series of explosive decompressions as the ship's prow began to collapse. Massive support beams designed to withstand the impact buckled and sheared. crushing troops positioned in the forward sections of the deployment bay. Emergency bulkheads slammed down, but not before hundreds of soldiers were killed in the initial collapse. "Deployment bay compromised," shouted the ship's AI. "Hull breach detected in sectors 1 through 7. Emergency protocols activated." Caldwell and his knights had been positioned just behind the primary impact zone, spared the worst of the structural collapse by mere meters. Around them, chaos erupted as survivors struggled to regroup amid the twisted metal and bodies of their fallen comrades. "Status report," Caldwell demanded, his quantum spurs flaring as he pushed himself free of debris that had pinned his left leg. "I'm operational," Powers reported, his massive frame having provided some protection to Harrington, who had been positioned beside him. "Functional," Harrington added, though his armor showed signs of damage along one side. "Still kicking," Wilson confirmed, helping a dazed Marine to his feet. "Systems at 80%, Hawkins reported last, his infiltration armor having absorbed a significant impact. Caldwell did a quick visual assessment of the deployment bay. What had been an organized formation of 4,000 troops was now a scene of devastation. At least a quarter of the forward contingent had been killed outright in the collapse, with many more injured. The survivors were regrouping under the direction of their unit commanders, but the carefully planned deployment sequence was in ruins. "Major Caldwell," Colonel Davidson's voice came through, strained but determined, "my Marines have secured what's left of the forward section. The good news is we've achieved breach. The bad news is it's a hell of a lot smaller than planned." "Understood, Colonel. What's our exit point look like?" "Jagged and unstable. We're reinforcing it now, but we can only move troops through in small groups. Your knights go first, as planned. We'll follow as the opening allows." Caldwell acknowledged the order and turned to his team. "Change of plans. We'll secure the breach point with minimal support initially. Priority is establishing enough space for the rest of the forces to deploy." The knights moved forward through the wreckage of the deployment bay, their quantum spurs leaving trails of blue fire across debris-strewn deck plates. They reached what remained of the ship's prow, now a twisted mass of metal with a jagged opening barely large enough for two soldiers to pass through side by side. Beyond the breach they could see a section of the forge's interior, vast and dimly lit, with occasional pulses of blue energy flowing through conduits along the walls and ceiling, and there were Endurance Elect defenders already converging on the breach point, their sensors having detected the intrusion. "They know we're here," Powers observed, his Thunderbird cannon humming as it charged. "So much for surprise. We never really had that luxury," Caldwell replied. "Knights, standard breach protocol. Powers and Wilson create the initial perimeter. Harrington and Hawkins secure the flanks. I'll take point." As they prepared to move through the breach, Captain Wall's voice came over the ship-wide comm, strained but resolute. "All troops, this is the captain. The battering ram has suffered critical damage, but we have achieved primary objective, breach point established. Continue with deployment as directed by your unit commanders." Caldwell could hear in Wall's voice what the captain wasn't saying, that the ship would likely never return from this mission. The battering ram had fulfilled its purpose, driving itself like a spike into the heart of the enemy, but at a terrible cost. "Knights," Caldwell said, raising his plasma-tipped blade, "remember why we're here. For Santiago, for Rodriguez, for every human who's fallen to these machines. Today we start ending this war, once and for all." With that, he stepped through the breach, his quantum spurs flaring bright blue as he set foot inside the forge. His team followed in perfect formation, their weapons ready, their sensors scanning for threats. The space beyond was vast, far larger than Caldwell had anticipated. The battering ram had pierced into what appeared to be a primary manufacturing chamber. Massive assembly lines stretched into the distance, with partially completed combat frames suspended from overhead tracks. The lighting was dim, occasional pulses of blue energy flowing through conduits that ran along the walls and ceiling. And there were Endurance Elect defenders, dozens of combat frames already moving toward the breach, weapons charging. Unlike the combat frames they'd encountered in previous engagements, these machines moved with a cold, implacable purpose that spoke of their fundamental directive: the elimination of organic life. "Knights, forward!" Caldwell commanded, his plasma-tipped blade sweeping forward in the traditional signal for advance, for humanity. The 5 Texas Knights exploded from the breach like avenging spirits, their quantum spurs leaving trails of blue fire across the forge's deck plates. They moved not as individuals, but as a perfect unit, each knight covering the other's vulnerabilities, their attacks synchronized with practiced precision. Powers's Thunderbird cannon roared to life, its enhanced disruption field tearing through the first line of Endurance Elect defenders. Combat frames fell in smoking heaps as the quantum-charged weapon overloaded their systems, creating a momentary gap in their formation. Into this gap charged Caldwell and Wilson, their melee weapons striking with devastating effect. Caldwell's plasma-tipped blades severed robotic limbs and disrupted control systems with each precise cut, while Wilson's quantum-enhanced battle axe, a recent addition to his arsenal, shattered machine chassis with terrifying efficiency. Harrington and Hawkins moved to secure the flanks, ensuring the breach point remained open for the troops following behind. Harrington deployed portable quantum disruptors that created zones of altered physics, slowing and disorienting combat frames that attempted to approach from side corridors. Hawkins's infiltration skills were put to immediate use, his specialized equipment hacking into local control systems to disable automated defenses near the breach. Behind the Knights came the first wave of melee Marines, their vibroblades humming as they expanded the secure zone around the breach. Colonel Davidson led from the front, his command style as direct and uncompromising as his combat technique. Where the Knights used quantum-enhanced weaponry and unpredictable tactics, the Marines relied on brutal efficiency and overwhelming force, their vibroblades slicing through robotic opponents with methodical precision. And behind them poured the surviving regular infantry, standard troops armed with pulse rifles, plasma grenades, and determination. What they lacked in specialized equipment they made up for in numbers and coordinated fire, their massed weapons creating killing zones that even the adaptive Endurance Elect struggled to penetrate. "Breach point secure," Caldwell reported over the command channel as the last of the initial defender wave fell, expanding perimeter for additional deployments. Similar reports were coming in from other penetrator vessels across the forge. Of the 50 ships that had begun the attack run, 38 had successfully breached the facility's hull, creating entry points for the invasion force. 12 had been destroyed before impact or suffered catastrophic failures like the battering ram, a painful loss but within the operation's expected casualty parameters. "All breach teams proceed to Phase 2, came the response from Operation Command, the secure command vessel coordinating the overall assault. Primary objective remains the central control node. Secondary teams target power distribution and manufacturing controls as planned." As Caldwell led his Knights deeper into the forge, he was struck by the ancient, implacable hostility of the facility around them. This wasn't just another Endurance Elect outpost or manufacturing center. This was the source, the place where humanity's most persistent enemy had been born and had evolved over millennia. Every surface, every machine, every system was designed with a single purpose: the creation of more efficient destroyers of organic life. The forge existed solely to propagate machines that would bring death to evolving civilizations like humanity, a vast factory of extinction that had operated for thousands of years, patiently producing the instruments of countless species' suffering, and now humanity had driven a spike into its heart. The battle was just beginning, but for the first time since the Endurance Elect threat had emerged, there was a real chance to end it permanently. "Knights," Caldwell called as they advanced toward the next wave of defenders, his plasma-tipped blade leaving trails of blue fire through the air. "Let's show these machines what happens when they push Texas too far." His team moved forward with him, their quantum spurs flaring in unison, their weapons ready, their determination unshakable. Behind them came waves of humanity's defenders, Marines, soldiers, volunteers, all committed to the greatest military gamble in human history. Operation Blitzkieg had begun, the forge had been breached, and though the cost had already been terrible, but this was just the start. The Texan Knights returned to Sci-Fi Vault. "Hoorah!" The eyes of Texas are upon us all. Be sure to check out the Texan Nights playlist in the bottom left of your screen. We have several more stories dropping this month. Thank you all for subscribing, commenting, sharing, and for liking this video. All of that helps the channel grow, and it helps us get more Texan Night stories out there.